Okay, folks, good evening. Trevor Booker here, and I'm going to be doing my talk today on Romans, Christianity's State of the Union, Bill of Rights, and a Plan of Action. I kind of gave it that title because to me, that's what the book of Romans really is about. It's about the problem with mankind, basically our situation and our rights and our condemnation and the opportunity for justification, which then leads to sanctification, of course, and ultimately the glorification. But humanity's impossible sin problem uh, satisfied by an unprecedented ultimate sacrifice. That really is what the book of Romans is about. Let's talk for a moment about saved by faith versus saved by grace. Now, this is interesting because I spent most of my adult life, I'm 57 years old, and I've been in church my entire life. The idea that people are saved by faith is certainly something I've heard preached many, many, many times, but as it turns out, that's not exactly true. And I've also heard that people are saved by grace through faith, but again, that is sometimes used synonymously with being saved by faith. And as I learned here, that's a slippery slope because if we're saved by faith alone, then it could be works based, and works based salvation is just not sustainable. A faith based salvation is not sustainable because we're all human, that at some point in time we're going to have a problem with our faith, and that then could put our salvation in jeopardy. But that's not the case. We're saved by grace. Also, if we're saved by faith, it reduces the magnitude of the matchless grace gift that we have in salvation as well, because it implies it has something to do with what we're doing, and it really doesn't. We're really saved simply by grace, the finished work on the cross, and it is our faith in that act by which we receive that gift, and that's where our salvation comes from. Let's talk about Christian faith. Rational versus irrational. Is our faith a rational perspective or irrational? And it could be either or. It really just depends on the person's perspective. Ignorance of God's character definitely equals irrational faith. So if you don't understand the person of who God is, his attributes and his character, you would have no reason to have faith. It would be irrational, right? But knowledge of God creates a rational faith, because once you understand his attributes and his character, it does seem a little bit more rational to believe in the claims of the Christian faith. But if you actually have a relationship with God, that's going to equal steadfast faith. I have down here, a man with an experience will never be at the mercy of a man with an opinion. And all that simply means is once you have tasted and seen, once you know the relationship that you have with the Lord, the faith that comes from that is much more steadfast because it's based on a personal, living, breathing experience. I know the love that I have for my wife and my trust in her comes from decades of knowing her, and that is where our faith becomes much stronger when we know our God that way. And then moving down to church tradition versus scriptural mandates. Again, a couple of areas of hang-ups here for me as well, because the Sabbath, I've always been under the belief that maintaining the Sabbath, not necessarily Saturday, but at least Sunday as a Sabbath, is God's idea, and that's something that is a scriptural mandate. Well, it turns out that's an Old Testament mandate, but not a New Testament mandate. It's a New Testament good idea, but not a New Testament mandate. It's not being enforced, according to Romans chapter 14 and verse 5. Other things like proper church attire. Again, I've been told you have to come to church in your Sunday best because it's showing God your best. Again, a good idea for sure. But whether it's formal, business casual dress, or casual is not so much the issue as much as the state of the heart, obviously, is what God sees. But again, we can get hung up on some of these things, and Romans talks about that. And then, of course, music style, whether it's traditional, contemporary, or extreme, that could be a slippery slope for sure. But again, it should be about the content of the music and not the style of music. So some pro tips from Romans, the book of Romans, Kingdom Life pro tips. Above them above and beyond. Let's not be a stumbling block. Let's keep in mind our younger Christians, people that are newer to the faith. Let's not get so caught up in our freedom and our license to do whatever personally is not a conviction for us as a license to maybe be an example to a new believer and make life more difficult for them. So take the higher road. And then temptation. It isn't sin. So let's not condemn people just because they're struggling with a certain temptation and not acting on that, right? That could be a stigmatism that we see in the church. And then all sin is equal with God. The church lady that's gossiping is just as guilty from God's point of view as the adulterer. So let's not have our pet sins either, because God sees all sin as being equal. We have to rise above that. Romans makes that very clear. We all fall short of the glory of God. Thank you.